Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to be here today, and thank you for your time to come along. I'm really excited to be able to present on some of the work that Brisbane City Council is doing in relation to koala conservation. Now, Councillor Davis has already mentioned it, but I'm going to start really high level, and I think this is something that underpins so much of the work we do, which is Brisbane City Council's vision to have 40% of mainland Brisbane as natural habitat. And we know if we're protecting our wildlife, protecting their habitat is absolutely critical. And when we're looking at that 40%, it's making sure we've got that habitat that's creating a diversity of habitat and that it's well connected as well. That's so important, as we know, for wildlife to be able to move through the landscape, particularly our more mobile species such as koalas. So as the councillor said, we're currently at 38.9% and we're tracking pretty well, but there's a lot more work to be done. It's fair to say this is an ambitious target for a capital city, but we're committed to sort of following through and making sure we see this happen. So, as I mentioned, habitat protection, it goes without saying, is just so critical for koalas and so many of our wildlife species. And one of the longest running environment programs that Brisbane City Council has been implementing is our Bushland Acquisition Program, funded through the Bushland Preservation Levy that some of you may see on your rates notices. This program has been running in Brisbane for non-stop for 32 years now, and in that time over 4,300 hectares of important habitat has been protected from development and other incompatible land uses. So for reference, that's about 3 times the size of Mount Cootha, so it's a pretty extraordinary area of land, and it's something that Council is continuing to invest in. We're continuing to protect these really important habitat areas for koalas and all our wildlife species. Some other really important investments, particularly in relation to koalas, is some of our pest animal management work. Now, we know that wild dogs in particular can be a real threat to koalas. We don't have wild dogs in all parts of Brisbane, but we know there are some parts of the city where we do see them, particularly in some of our outer suburbs. And we have a very hard-working and committed pest animal management team that's working really hard to remove these species and the associated threats that they create to our environment. In terms of putting back some of our habitat, we also have an environmental offsets program that's undertaking extensive large-scale habitat restoration, particularly focusing on a lot of our corridors across Brisbane. So that's about putting back natural habitat. And while those trees grow, because look, it does take time for trees to grow, particularly for our other wildlife, we're also looking at supplementing some artificial habitat features in some of these areas to provide spaces for wildlife as those trees grow and mature. So as of now, over 300 hectares is being restored through that program, with another 80 hectares to be delivered over the next year. So lots more work to be done there. Another really important one, and certainly one that generates quite a lot of interest, is our Wildlife Movement Solutions program, which is focusing on one of the biggest threats we see to koalas, particularly within an urban environment, which is roads and our transport corridors. Now, they're a threat to koalas both in terms of the fact that they can fragment habitat, but they're also a mortality risk for vehicle strikes. So really, really challenging space, but certainly something that we want to keep focusing on. So we look at a few different strategies around wildlife movement solutions, or WMS, because government loves acronyms. So we're looking at built infrastructure. So that, for example, includes things such as our land bridges, our underpasses, fences. That helps fauna such as koalas to move across roads or stay away from roads where they might need to do that. Driver awareness, so that's about making sure that we're letting motorists know how they should respond in areas where there are higher numbers of wildlife, and then also looking at how we manage vegetation around these areas to funnel wildlife. It's fair to say that any time you're working around a road, it's incredibly challenging because there is an awful lot of engineering rules that come into working around roads, and a lot of those are really non-negotiable for road safety standards. But that can make things really challenging. Means we've got to get really creative sometimes in terms of what those options are for us to look at these strategies. So there's a few examples that I'll run through of some of the types of infrastructure that we've installed across parts of Brisbane. And it's fair to say our focus in terms of these investments is very much on those areas where we see the wildlife vehicle strikes, particularly for those vulnerable species such as koalas, which we know are just quite significantly impacted often by road mortality. So we do collect data from a variety of sources on koala vehicle strikes and use that to inform how we prioritise these investments. So a few examples, some of our habitat poles on the left there, which provide refuge for koalas while habitat is restoring around them. People sometimes think they're public art because they kind of look funky, but they may look funky, but that's not, they are there for koalas. Fencing, of course, so important to funnel wildlife towards safe crossing points and also the complementary escape poles. Ledges, which we look at under bridges and culverts to help koalas get off the ground, make sure their feet aren't getting wet as they move through those spaces. Some of our driver awareness, we've just wrapped up our annual variable message sign campaign where we put those big punchy sort of road signs at those known hotspots really sort of in people's faces when they're driving through these areas to be aware of koalas, particularly during that breeding season, which we know is the, a real problem time. So I'm sure many of you have seen our flashing LED smiley face koala wildlife awareness monitors, or the WMS as we call them, which help remind people, similar to some of our other speed monitors, slow down if you're going too fast. And also our pavement thresholds to just sort of demarcate where we've got those significant wildlife populations. And a bit of an example of how some of all that wildlife movement solution work can come together is happening through the project that we're calling the Belmont Hills to Whites Hill project. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this part of Brisbane, Belmont Hills Reserve and Whites Hill Reserve are within the suburbs of Carina, Carindale, Mansfield area, within Brisbane's inner eastern suburbs. And this area supports a tremendous population of koalas. But as you can probably see from the aerial photo, very suburban. So you can imagine for the koalas moving through this area, they're encountering a lot of challenges in this space. So we're looking at a whole bunch of strategies to try and improve outcomes for koalas here. So that includes undertaking some large-scale habitat restoration through those corridors. So specifically planting up about 20 hectares. So that's about 51,000 koala trees that we're establishing through these corridors to help facilitate that koala movement and provide future food resources as well for these animals. And of course, any habitat restoration helps our other species in these areas as well. We're also working really closely with some of our research partners, which I'll touch on in a moment, to actually monitor how koalas are dispersing through this area. And this is helping us to understand whereabouts and how we need to be investing to make more of a difference in these spaces. And one of the sort of key examples of wildlife movement structures that we've recently completed in this precinct is the bespoke boundary road overhead fauna crossing, which was designed specifically with the koalas in mind, and it's designed to connect directly into the canopy of the trees either side of that road, so that koalas, they can access the structure from the ground if they want, but they can actually move through the trees directly onto the structure and cross over that road. So we're monitoring the outcomes of that at the moment, but it's been pretty exciting to design a completely custom featured structure for that section of road. So as I sort of hinted at before, another really key investment we're making, which is creating some pretty exciting outcomes, is our koala research work, which is really focusing on tackling some of those threats such as disease, which in a suburban area we know is a real challenge. So through Council's Koala Research Partnerships Program, a lot of this work was actually inspired by the initial extensive koala survey that Council did across our natural areas and parks in the city using specially trained koala detection dogs. And that's Missy and Taz there on the left from OWAD Environment, who went through all of our major natural areas in the city to get a sense of the distribution of our koalas, their health, their genetic diversity. It provided an incredible amount of information, and it showed that we're lucky koalas occur in pretty much all of our natural areas across Brisbane. But it did show we've got problems with the disease in some areas, and we've got other things that we need to tackle. So this research is really aiming at addressing some of those. So we've got a few research programs that we're working with universities at the moment. So I'll just run through some of them fairly briefly. So the first project is with our Federation University of Australia. So they're developing a simple, cheap methodology to better assess the genetic diversity of our koalas, because understanding that is actually so vital to make sure, first of all, we're not risking inbreeding, and second of all, to make sure we're actually allowing and rectifying any issues we may have with that sort of genetic dispersal. So we're making sure our populations stay resilient, they stay healthy. So as part of that project, we've been running some more koala detection dog surveys, and they can actually pull out all the genetic material from the scats, koala scats, that the dogs find. So really amazing what you can get out of poo, quite frankly. It's, yeah, an incredible source of information. And the dogs are awfully good at finding it. Project number 2, University of the Sunshine Coast. So this project actually wrapped up last year, and this was really looking at the relationship between koala retrovirus and chlamydia. Now, unfortunately in Queensland, all koalas have koala retrovirus. It's kind of part of their genome now. But what's not 100% understood at this point is the relationship between the retrovirus and chlamydia, and we know chlamydia is a particularly insidious disease in koalas that, you know, can frequently cause death. So what this research was really looking at is what's the relationship between the different types of retrovirus that koalas can get and the risk of them catching or suffering from chlamydia. So that actually was able to pinpoint some of our more vulnerable populations across Brisbane that we've then been able to feed into other research to actually help eradicate that disease, so that we're actually on the front foot and we're tackling the most problematic sort of spaces. So I'll talk on that just in a second. But before we do that, another project number 3 is with the University of Queensland. So they're doing some work for us looking at koala probiotics. And I think there's a lot more research happening, particularly around like the importance of gut health. You probably sort of hear it in relation to people and you know how important that is to people's immunity. It's not that different for koalas. But the challenge for koalas, of course, particularly koalas being treated for chlamydia, is they often need to be treated with very heavy doses of antibiotics, and that can really impact their gut flora. And for a koala, the gut flora is absolutely vital because it's how they digest those toxic eucalyptus leaves. So that can really impact the survivability of koalas that are recovering from these diseases such as chlamydia. So what this project is looking at is creating probiotics that can be given out to wildlife carers and hospitals to support koalas in care, recovering from illness, and probiotics that have a long shelf life. So they're really easy and quick for these carers to administer, which just makes everyone's life so much easier. And the final project that we're doing, also with the University of Queensland, this is the project that's looking on ground at some of our natural areas and looking to tackle some of those disease hotspots. So some of you might have seen an article a few months ago that was distributed about some of the amazing work that this team is doing in areas such as Belmont Hills Reserve in Carindale, where they actually took what was unfortunately a very heavily disease-affected population and for the most part almost eradicated any disease in that area. And we're now seeing that population breeding and growing, which is incredibly exciting to see that turnaround. And this team's doing a whole lot of other work around dispersal and some other exciting things which we look forward to sharing in the future, but it's really improving our understanding of our koalas across the city, so they're doing some amazing work. And finally, a few other things in terms of how the community can otherwise contribute to, and some of the work that Council does to contribute to community efforts. So we've got our Wildlife Conservation Partnerships program, where we support really dedicated and passionate landowners to protect habitat on their properties. So I think it's about over 2,600 hectares of land which is currently sort of captured within that program. Yes, it is. Just check my stats. That's pretty incredible. That's a huge area and a huge number of dedicated property owners that are working to helping protected habitat for our species such as koalas. Our fabulous Habitat Brisbane and Creek Catchment Program, which supports hundreds of volunteers to actively go and restore habitat along particularly a lot of our corridors and waterways, which we know are so vital and often that preferred habitat for koalas. And our koala fodder plantation as well, which was established at Wacol to provide a food source for our carers and other people that sort of are involved in wildlife care as well. So hopefully that's covered everything, but thank you very much for your time, everyone.